Okay, let me frame the argument that the Japanese metal scene is operating with the same creative velocity that I felt during the 1980s. And I'm going to use 5 bands to demonstrate it. One of them is elegant, one of them is chaotic, one of them steady, one of them sexy, and one of them is hungry. 5 bands, but 5 very different things in one scene. I'm going to touch on how, to me, they match up in what I heard and I felt from the 80s scene for metal and hard rock back in our formative years, and that shaped that genre because the pattern is remarkable. And then each of those 5 words is going to be a subject of a deeper dive on our Music Cities Patreon. There's a link in the description if you want to go below the surface. In the meantime, let me tell you how I got here.
We had lunch with Nico McBrain a few weeks ago, and one of the other things we talked about was Halloween. And I realized something. The reason Halloween mattered in the 80s was not just the music. It was that they proved that European power metal, it could stand next to those American and British giants in the scene. So they earned themselves a seat at the table, and it's a table that wasn't built for them. I'm watching the same thing happen again right now, but this time it's happening in Japan. And this time it's women. And the band that made me realize this was Lovebites. And see, Lovebites was my band of the year for 2025. It's probably the band more than any other that's responsible for how the channel has grown and built. Not my Japanese band of the year, not my girl metal band of the year, my band of the year for 2025, full stop. Lovebites is not alone, though. They're one of 5 bands I'm watching right now. There's a lot more than these 5, and people are going to have different opinions. But there's 5 that I'm watching right now that make me feel something that I haven't felt about new music and the discovery of new music since the 1980s. And it's not nostalgia, maybe a tiny bit, and it's not a comparison for its own sake of comparison. It's a creative velocity that I haven't felt in 40 years, and all of a sudden I start feeling it when I watch these bands. And so today we're going to talk about what I'm going to call the new Big 5. And how they compare to the 80s metal that I grew up on. And why this scene feels like something bigger than a revival. Because it's something that it feels, some of these bands feels really familiar in a deja vu type of way, but it's also refreshingly new. But that sense of excitement and discovery is the same that I felt in the 80s as it was just evolving. The metal scene was just evolving through them. So first, what are the anchors? So before we get to my Big 5, let's talk about where the scene comes from. Every movement has its elders, the bands that were already there when the new wave arrived, the bands that every young musician in the scene cites when they're asked who made this possible or what their influences were. When the 80s American metal scene, those elders, they were Black Sabbath, and it was Deep Purple. They didn't sound like Metallica or Iron Maiden or Guns N' Roses. They didn't need to. They were the foundation that those bands built on top of. Well, in Japan, those elders are Loudness and Maximum the Hormone. Loudness, they were the first Japanese metal band to break internationally. And I remember they were part of that 80s scene. Thunder in the East in 1985 came out on a major American label, and they had some success on the Billboard chart. And it was a Japanese band. It was operating in the same spaces as those American acts that we all grew up listening to. Maximum the Hormone came later, but it served the same function for the next generation, especially the next generation in Japan. They were a Japanese band, and they refused to fit into any Western category. And they blended hardcore and metal and pop and comedy into something that was uniquely their own. And they proved that a Japanese band could have a distinct identity in metal without having to translate itself for a Western audience. Now, neither of these bands sounds like the Big 5 we're about to talk about, and that's not the point. The Big 5 don't necessarily sound like them. Lovebites sounds a lot more like some of that European metal that we grew up on than directly those bands, but those bands are the foundation. The point here is that Hanabie and Bridear, they all grew up in a world where Loudness and Maximum the Hormone had already proven that it could be done. And so these are the shoulders the new scene stands on, not necessarily that you hear one's music in the other. But there's a principle here of commitment. And so I want to make a point that runs underneath everything else that I'm going to talk about. So I got a text from my friend a few weeks ago. Oski ran the Brutality Metal Fest here in Miami that you've seen us post about. He watched every band that played, and his unprompted take on McFisty, my band, was this quote in a text to me yesterday, actually 2 days ago. Rocked hard as fuck. no fluff, just rock. And my response to him was 4 words. That's all you need. Because that's the whole argument. We're not the most technical band on the bill. We're not the most talented band on the bill. We're not the most polished band on the bill. We're the loudest. We're not the flashiest. We're not the fastest. We're just one that's there, and we're committed to our own thing, and we're committed to delivering it at the maximum intensity that we're able to. That's what rock, and that's what lasts. And that's what every band there does in their own unique way. And that's how we are all differentiated and how it all works together in the scene. But back to the Big Five, every band in my Big Five now, they don't try to be each other. They're as different as all of us in our local Miami scene are. This is not Bandmaid, and it's not Nemophila, and it's not Bridear, and it doesn't try to be anybody. And they have some crossover fan bases, but they don't have the same fan bases. They're each very unique in who they are, but there's this discovery through the algorithm that I think helps bring them all together, and unfortunately kind of get lumped in together by some people who don't really fully understand what's happening with the Japanese metal scene. But each one of those bands has figured out what their thing, and they deliver it without apology and fearlessly. That's the same thing that 80s bands did. Iron Maiden wasn't better than ACDC because Iron Maiden was more technical. ACDC was not better than Priest because they were more direct and in your face. Every one of them was committed, and every one of them delivered what they were there to deliver. And so what we have here with Japanese metal is we have one country and we have one moment, but we don't have, it's not one genre, and it's not one homogenous group. And so we're going to do some matches, and I'm just doing this for fun, and you're all going to disagree, and I don't care. I'm happy to hear what your matches are, or even if you think this is a stupid idea. Anyway, but one more thing before we get there. If you're a fan of any of these bands, you've probably been annoyed by the fact that the Western press lumps them all together and under the label of this Japanese girl metal, like it's not one sound. These 5 bands share a country, and they share a moment, and they share a fearlessness and an unapologetic approach, but they don't share a genre. Lovebites isn't Hanabie to their own thing, not to sharing a common sound. And when you lump them together, you're doing the same thing the press did in the 80s when it shoved Metallica and Poison and Maiden into the same category because they all had long hair and loud guitars. It misses the point then, and it misses the point now. The point now, it's really cool to see women so engaged and so talented in metal, but these aren't great bands because they're women. These aren't great women bands. These are just great, awesome heavy metal bands, period. So the comparisons I'm going to make, these are not about proving these bands are the same as the 80s bands. 40 years ago, it's different times in music has changed and evolved. But it's about finding the 80s band that, to me, each Japanese band most resembles in spirit, in posture, in the specific thing that each one does well. And so number 1 on my list, my 2 favorite bands, Love is the Iron Maiden of this scene. And so why? Twin guitar harmonies that interlock instead of compete and go on and on and on are just incredible. You know, galloping tempos and these big epic song structures that run 5, 6, even more minutes, and they don't lose their tension. Under the Red Sky is my, that's on my epic list right after Rime of the Ancient Mariner on a playlist. They've got these clean, powerful vocals, and they're riding on top of technical precision. It's the Iron Maiden template. Murray and Smith were building this melodic architecture, and Bruce was soaring over it, and Steve Harris was galloping the whole thing along from the bass. And Lovebites does the same thing. Midori and Mia are on twin guitars, and they're trading leads, and they harmonize in the way that Maiden did. Asami is in just this awesome vocal register, and it's this clean power. It doesn't strain. Una is not a basher. She is so precise behind the kit. I mean, perfect match here with Nico and his style, and using Steve Harris and Fami on bass. She's a lead melodic instrument. She's not just a foundation taking it along. And so if they're full strength, in this comparison isn't a stretch. The only question is a debate. Oh, them actually being better than Maiden, which very well might be an accurate statement. But they're operating in that Maiden tradition with the same level of craft that made Maiden legendary. And they're the band of the year for us in 2025, and they earned it. Now, number 2 on our list, we're going to go to Bandmaid. And this to us is the ACDC of the scene. But we've got a little twist to it. ACDC first, the groove, the swing. Every song is built on a riff that you can feel in your hips. And before you hear it in your ears, ACDC, they never pretended to be complicated. They just made rock that hit. They locked these rhythm sections in, and they had this really disciplined songwriting, even if it wasn't complicated. And they had this visual hook, and the music really worked. The school board uniform and the maid outfits, they do the same thing. And it gives an entry point to the audience. And then it gets out of the way because the music just takes over. And Bandmaid, they've locked that in. And, Misa and Akane are just this pocket that doesn't quit. The riffs that they write, they breathe. And it's how ACDC thought. And it feels like if you're a guitarist, when you listen to it, it feels attainable. It feels like, okay, I can't play that Maiden song, but I can play this ACDC song. I can't play that Lovebites solo, but I can play Thrill by Bandmaid. But here's a twist. ACDC made the same record for 40 years. And that's not a criticism. That's the mission. And that's what made them successful. Bandmaid didn't. So if you listen to their arc from it through Unseen World and then into Epic Narratives, the arrangements get more ambitious and the dynamics get wider. The songwriting gets more compositional. And so it's not, we've got a double for Bandmaid. And so they've kind of moved into reminding us of the Use Your Illusion era of Guns N' Roses thinking, okay? Not the Appetite era. Appetite was 5 guys in a van just creating chaos on the Sunset Strip. Use Your Illusion was that band, after getting some discipline to set in, some piano alongside the guitars, orchestration next to the riffs, and longer songs. Konami is writing guitar parts now that are closer to Slash on November Rain than the Angus Young on Highway to Hell. And melodic solos that build inside these better arranged structures. So Bandmaid has AC/DC foundation and a Use Your Illusion ceiling. They start as one thing and they're becoming another. And again, doing it without apology. And that's their move. But now to
One I've been listening to a lot. Number 3 on our list is Nemophila.
To us, the Judas Priest of this. I consider Guns N' Roses here for the attitude. And I almost went that way, but Guns is sleaze and chaos and looseness as a feature. And Priest is more disciplined while still sort of a controlled chaos. Still wilder. They bring a different type of energy than Maiden has on the stage, and which is what Nemophila does compared to the energy that you get from a Lovebites on the stage. And Nemophila is that sort of weaponized discipline. Priest took the heaviness that Sabbath had created and they put leather and studs on it and the scream, and it's Halford becoming a weapon in the band, not singing over it. Tipton and Downing and those twin guitars, they weren't that collaborative twin guitar thing that Maiden had going on. They were dueling. They were fighting each other with their guitars. It was cutting and it was aggressive. And Priest on stage is more confrontational, and they're daring you to kind of keep up with them. And that is exactly what Nemophila is. Mayu is a Halford class vocalist and can go from melodic to just throat-ripping screams in the same phrase, and she's not going to lose her pitch. Misaki and guitar dynamic was more Priest than Guns N' Roses. Precision, aggression, and not the bluesy swagger that Slash brings. Slash will play around the beat, and Saki plays on top of it. And the stage presence, the live energy that Nemophila has is what Priest had at their peak. You can watch some live video. Oren, I think, comes to mind. Watch some of their videos and the energy, and it's especially the live videos, and I think about just the Painkiller video and that energy. And what they're doing is instead of asking you to come along with them as a crowd, as a fan, they're daring you to keep up with them. So the hardest match was, okay, I tried to pin this one down, and that's kind of the point, because we're getting into a place where you don't have these perfect matches. But I still wanted to do this exercise. But number 4,
They're at this intersection of, for me, sort of 3 80s bands.
They're at the intersection of 3 80s band. And so the primary comp for me, now we're going back to Guns, is the Appetite era Guns N' Roses. You see, these girls play with a hunger that's different than from the other 4. They're not the most technical band in this lineup, but they're the hungriest. Kimmy on vocals has a scream to clean fluency that nobody in the 80s had access to. They chase songs instead of executing them and delivering them. And there's just this, even in the recordings and there's a rawness that they have, and it's 5 people in a room, not 5 people just being produced. And that's the energy that Appetite for Destruction era Guns had. You know, Slash and Izzy, they weren't trying to out technical play anybody. They were just turning up the intensity and the volume as loud as possible and trying to get it caught on record. And Bridear has that same posture, at least to me. And then, but we transition. I've got a second comp for them, and I'm going to go into thrash. And at first, I had a different thought, but for me, it's Exodus and that thrash DNA, the aggression first, refusal to polish for a bigger audience. You know, Bridear could have softened up and chased sort of the Bandmaid crossover audience, but they didn't do that. That's Exodus. You know, Gary Holt made thrash records that stayed thrash records. And so I thought about some Testament in there too. And I had thought about Testament instead of Exodus. And maybe there's some Testament in there too with some technical precision in the melodies. And there is musicianship that's under. And so you do think that this is a band that is better than its position in commercial music, even in Japan, might suggest. But so we've got really maybe 3 legitimate comps, depending on which angle you want to emphasize. Appetite Guns, Exodus thrash DNA, and Testament on musicianship. And all 3 are true, and it's what makes Bridear so hard to pin down. It's also what makes them worth paying attention to. And now number 5. Hanabie, a band I've seen more than any of the other Japanese bands. I've seen Lovebites once, and by the end of the summer, I'll have seen them 2 more times. But there's not a clean 80s comp. And that's probably the most important part of the episode. You know, Lovebites plays in the Maiden tradition. Bandmaid is evolving past DC. Bridear sits at the intersection of 3 80s bands. Hanabie is doing what they call Harajuku core. Harajuku core, and it didn't exist before them. Breakdowns and guttural vocal flips and this idle aesthetic, and just slammed straight into metalcore. It's not really a tribute to anything. It's a new thing. And so the closest 80s echo for me, is Anthrax around the I'm the Man, 1987. The second Anthrax smashed rap and thrash together on that track. I think they broke the rule that metal had to take itself too seriously to be heavy. The crossover and the humor they had, the refusal to pick a lane, the willingness to look ridiculous while being super, super aggressive. That's the operating system that Hanabie has. And then my other comp is Pantera for the crowd engagement. Phil Anselmo did not perform the crowd. He did not perform at the crowd. He did not perform to the crowd. He performed with the crowd. He demanded participation, and he made the audience part of the show. And Hanabie has that same thing live, especially Yukina. She's not entertaining to the crowd. She is conducting them, and she's bringing them in as part of the show. But neither of those comps is a full match. Anthrax plus Pantera minus a clean 80s equivalent is the band in this big 5 that proves the Japanese metal scene is not just recreating the 80s. It's producing something the 80s couldn't have produced. And they're doing it fearlessly and unapologetically. And that's why they are a 2026 Band of the Year at the Music Cities. So now we're going to throw in one more. We're going to give you an epilogue of whatever they call it, a bonus. And we're going to talk about Babymetal. Now, Babymetal is not in the big 5. And it's not because they're lesser. It's because they play a different game. They are in many ways what drives the algorithm. They are how many Western metalheads discovered all the bands that I just talked about. Is about hearing Babymetal, seeing Babymetal, and letting the algorithm go from there and find all of this other awesome Japanese music. See, Babymetal is not a band in the same sense as the 5 we just talked about. They're a project. They're a concept that is executed at this extraordinary level. But it's a concept first. It is a crazy innovation that worked and created new market. And they're the gateway drug into Japanese metal. The 3 vocalists, the girls, they don't write the music. The Kami band are session players. These are top musicians, but they're not necessarily a fixed creative unit. The artistic direction comes from the production of the founder, Koba Metal. So it's a mix of production team and musicians and performers. It's just something different, and it's an incredible production, and it's incredible talent and spectacle to watch. So it's not a criticism. It's just different than everything else. It's a different animal. It's unique. It's something that had never been seen before. And there is an 80s analog for that. It goes back starting in the 70s, and that's Kiss. Kiss in the 70s, 80s was not primarily a band. It was a brand. And it had a band inside of it. The makeup and the costumes and the pyro and the lunchboxes and the comic books. The music was real and the musicians were real, but the music, it served the spectacle and not the other way around. Kiss understood they were selling an experience. And ultimately it became, well, you had Gene and Paul always, and later on, Eric and Tommy were there for a long time, but the other members, it was discovered, could be interchangeable. And Kiss could go on with session musicians. Now without Paul and Gene, probably not. But, Kiss understood that they were selling an experience, a production. And Babymetal operates in the same way. The choreography is not incident. It is central to it. The visual language, the lore, the Foxcott, the 3-act live shows, the merch, the anime crossovers, it's all built as a total product, the same way that Kiss is built as a total product. Same way that Kiss is going on forever, even without the live band. Now, the music is excellent, much better than Kiss's music. I love Kiss's music. It's simpler than even ACDC. Babymetal's music is excellent. Su-metal is legitimately a great, awesome folk. But the music is one instrument in a larger orchestra of the overall brand. And so it gets interesting here because it kind of ties it back together, because Kiss and Japan had a relationship that nobody else in American rock had. Alive 2 was recorded partially at Budokan in 1977. The Japanese fans showed up for Kiss at a scale Americans hadn't yet reached. And Kiss just took it in and absorbed it. The Hotter Than Hell album cover in 1974 is straight kabuki and Japanese horror film aesthetic. Love Gun in 77 has the same hyper-stylized theatrical composition. The makeup itself is closer to kabuki face paint than to American theater tradition. And so Kiss borrowed from Japan to build their aesthetic. And Babymetal is Japan borrowing from Western metal to build theirs. But all with that same fearless theatrical commitment. The same cross-cultural translation, running in reverse 49 years later. And the flip, look at the Love Gun cover. 4 gods up on a pedestal, 4 rock gods up on a pedestal. Theatrical, untouchable, out of reach, with the women arranged below, gazing. 1977. Men as the spectacle, women as the audience. Flip it. Go to a Lovebites show. Go to a Nemophila show. Go to a Bandmaid show. You have Asami and Mayu and Mika and Saki and Kimi. They're all commanding the stage, and the floor is packed with all these dudes looking up at them with the same reverence the Love Gun women were drawn to with Kiss. 50 years later, the pedestal got rearranged. Theatrical experience that Kiss invented, the musicianship that Japan's been quietly building through 2 generations, and then a fundamental inversion of who stands on the pedestal and who looks up. The 80s feeling didn't just come back, it came back completed. And so our big 5 is a snapshot. It's not a permanent list. The scene has depth and it goes way past this 5. And the next waves are already forming. There's many more that are part of this wave. And there's some who've already come and gone. Obvious went on indefinite hiatus this year, which is why they're not in the big 5. And they should be. But Toki, their guitarist, didn't walk away from the scene. She reached out. She's joined up with Miho, a Lovebites founder who left back in 2021, 2022. And they started a new band called Zilqy. It's a 4-piece, all women and all on vocals, Toki on guitar, Miho on bass, and Kano on drums. They debuted in November with their first EP, Vacant Throne. Their first live show in Tokyo was not too long ago. I don't remember exactly when. What makes them interesting is, I almost think this is probably the maybe a stretch, but I was trying to think of how would I make a comparison here. Maybe they're the Mr. Big of the scene. See, in 1988, Billy Sheehan left David Lee Roth. Paul Gilbert left Racer X. Eric Martin was already a working solo artist, and Pat Torpey was probably the most in-demand session drummer in all of LA. Any one of those 4 guys could have built the band that they individually wanted to build and build it in their image or in their vision. And they had the catalogs, they had the credibility, they had the reputations. They could have got anybody to come and do it with them. But they took a different route. They built a band identity instead of 4 different solo vehicles. And Mr. Big worked because nobody in that band was compromising to be there. Everybody was there because they believed in the group project and they would produce something better than any solo project could. And the proof was not to shred records. The proof was To Be With You, a song that stands on its own merit. It's not a showcase, not really a metal song, but it's just a song. Zilke has that same setup. Toki and Miho could have each started their own solo projects, just trading on their own established names and past success. But instead, they got Anna and Kano, and they built this creative partnership in a four-piece, following that same choice that the guys in Mr. Big and made. It's a specific kind of artistic maturity, and it's more rare. I think that's why we looked at Mr. Big. There's not a lot of examples we can look out there and find for this. So it's not a question of whether they can play. We know they can. It's a question of what all four of them saw in each other that made them think this partnership could produce something that none of them could make alone. That's what I want to ask them about, so stay tuned. So to wrap up, the 80s were not about any one band. It was about velocity. It was about new bands every month, and it was about scenes colliding, and nobody was asking permission. Nobody was apologizing. And that's the feeling you get when you watch what's happening in Japan now in heavy metal. It's not that women are doing it, it just happens to be women that are doing it. And not to say there aren't men doing it, but the best is being done by the women. If you lived through the first one in the 80s, you owe it to yourself to pay attention to the second one. Lovebites, Bandmaid, Nemophila, Bridear, Hanabie, Babymetal running their own game on the Kiss playbook, Zilke in the next wave, and all these others coming. It's not a revival of the 80s. It's the 80s finally getting completed. Anyway, I'm Kevin Crowder. This is the Music Cities. Let's do it. See ya.